So next up to the stage, another great conversation. We have a fireside conversation on tokenization with Ripple. Can I bring up to the stage Matt Donovan and Bill Morgan?
Working, yes. How are you, Matthew?
I'm good. How you doing, Bill?
I'm very good, thanks. You're enjoying your stay?
It's been great. I just want to maybe kick it off with a thank you, right, to the XRP and XRPL and broader community. We were invited through, obviously, the XRP Gold Coast team, and I've been to a lot of events, and this is probably the most friendly, engaging, and community-driven one that I've been to, which is exciting. Right, because we on Ripple, again, we go to these conferences with our Ripple hats on very often, and maybe too often. But I think what I'm seeing is that there's a broader community, an extension of communities, right, with others in the Futureverse network and the Root network, and others who are really building and helping pioneer. And I couldn't share the sentiment that Crypto Erie had mentioned, where developers need to continue to flood into the XRPL ecosystem and build new products. So a gratitude from us at Ripple, and maybe a round of applause for you, Bill, Crypto Erie, Matt, and Ali, and all the great folks that I've continued to meet.
Thanks, Matthew. Look, I'm really glad to have this opportunity to talk to you, and I just want to start, just so people understand your background, how you got started in crypto, and what your role is at Ripple.
Yeah, so I actually got started in blockchain before crypto. And I make that distinction because my entry into the space was not what could Bitcoin mean as a store of value, or even XRP as a form of payment. It was really what could distributed ledger technology mean for data privacy. And so what I mean by that is in 2016, I actually tried to start my own project. So I have a ton of respect and passion for what the builders in here are doing. But really the concept was enabling you, me, folks in this audience to create a personal data vault of their own where they can store their consumer behavioral information and data. So a blockchain encrypted data vault where we could create one-to-one connections between us and our favorite retail companies. I think we were a bit too early, and I was right out of university and a bit naive. A great concept, but yeah, I think that was sort of the foray into this space. And inevitably, when you're building, right, you're trying to understand who else is here. And that was how I actually came across Chris Larson and Brad Garlinghouse talking about this Internet of Value. I don't know if I truly knew what it meant at the time, but I knew that they were working with different types of financial institutions globally. So 2 years later, after doing some consulting work, because I needed money, I joined Ripple. I've always sat within a business development function, and today head up the bulk of our partnerships from a tokenization standpoint, particularly focused on real-world assets.
Thank you. And what's your day-to-day role look like? What's a day for you at Ripple? What does that involve?
Yeah, so there's two different business units within Ripple, right? There's RippleNet, which you can think of as building core custody, payments, and liquidity services that we directly distribute into the market. I sat on that side for about 2.5 years, building out the infrastructure for that payments product to operate, mainly centralized exchanges, market makers, and then bringing on different types of payment service providers, money service businesses, et cetera, to leverage it. Did that for 2.5 years, and most recently, over the last 2.5, have been on the Ripple X side of our business, which you can really more so think of as the foray into tokenization, DeFi, stablecoins, and more crypto-native use cases. And so for me, what I spend a lot of time on within this side of the business is getting the XRP Ledger integrated into all the different service providers and app layers that are building in this space. So ultimately, we as Ripple can help sort of broker relationships between these service providers and these app layers into institutions globally. And my day-to-day is really ensuring that, one, the infrastructure is there, the financial markets infrastructure, and then secondly, we have the relationships with the institutions who can leverage it.
I'd say you've seen both sides of the business.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Are you the
5
next
years'
Brad?
time.
You the next Brad?
No idea.
Ripple is known for transferring value around the world, the instant transfer of value, and also managing and custody and tokenization. So it's tokenization that we're looking at today, which we want to concentrate on. Can you share with our audience what is tokenization? How do you understand tokenization and how it is used in everyday business cases?
Yeah, I feel it's become a bit of a buzzword, and you can kind of lose meaning when you're just talking about a definition, and it's almost a circular definition, at least it seems sometimes. So I think very simply, for me, it's converting the rights of diverse assets, whether that's bonds or equities, real estate, cultural assets, and representing the ownership of those assets on the blockchain in a token form. And so why do we do that? I think we should think about it in a similar context of why we've evolved from writing handwritten letters to now text messages and email and Slack and Telegram, you name it. And so in that way, I think it's very much an evolution versus a pure revolution. And so beyond that, I think there are greater efficiencies that we're seeing, right? So there are cost efficiencies that you can see, right? Where particularly when you're tokenizing securities, you're limiting a ton of different intermediaries that sit within that value chain. By nature, when these assets are on a blockchain, there's greater transparency and immutability, right? So I can't think but back to the 2008 financial crisis, or even most recently with the Silicon Valley Bank sort of explosion. If all of those assets were on a blockchain, invisible, not that you could have avoided those catastrophes, but maybe mitigated or caught them earlier. And so I think we really need to remember that during that Silicon Valley Bank crash, DeFi operated without hitch, right? So I think the last thing to mention in terms of tokenization and why I think it's important is it can democratize access. So you're limiting some of the global guardrails that we've seen where people globally can buy, hold, trade these assets, and then even further downstream, fractionalize them, right? And that can drive down the minimum investment thresholds that we've seen. And so I think the real benefit of this comes in two different forms then. It creates greater liquidity, and within the greater liquidity, I forget who had mentioned it, inevitably you're going to see people and developers start to build net new products on top of that liquidity, composability. And to me, that is the really killer app and killer use case within crypto, is not just putting these assets on a blockchain, but when they're all in digital form and able to talk to each other, the composability that can happen in 5-10 years' time is going to be something we've never seen before. And so for Ripple, I think what we're focused on right now is ensuring that we're bringing different types of real-world assets onto the XRP Ledger, whether that's tokenized money market funds, private equity, you name it. So eventually, these XRPL-based assets can trade against each other. How cool would it be if you can trade a tokenized money market fund against XRP or an XRPL stablecoin? And so that, along with some of the net new features that we're seeing within the AMM, really excite me. And I think what I'm getting even more excited about is that others in this room and more broadly are so switched on and they absolutely get where the puck is heading. And I can't wait to be more and more a part of it.
Yeah, well, that's a good question, is where is it heading? You heard what I said yesterday in my speech about the fact that the Australian government, for example, expects an increasing tokenization of real world assets. Why should we care? Where do you think it's going?
Where do I think it's going? Look, I think maybe zooming out, what we need to understand is that this Bitcoin ETF is a bit of a Trojan horse for tokenization, right? Because all of a sudden, and by the way, it's been the most successful ETF launch in history, right? Where you have around 12 billion worth of inflows within the first 2 months. And so I think there's multiple levels and layers to how to answer this question, where all of a sudden you've now onboarded tens of trillions of dollars worth of global equity accounts that can start clicking buttons and buying exposure to this type of asset class. Is it on chain? No, but I think that's okay, because underneath all of this, different types of banks and financial institutions are building their own tokenized products, right? You see what JP Morgan has done with their Onyx platform, or HSBC, now a customer and partner of Ripple's based on our acquisition of Medico that Ross had mentioned. They're all building these services. So, first and foremost, Jamie Dimon can call Bitcoin a pet rock all he wants. He's been employing people since 2016 to build distributed ledger technology. And so this whole Bitcoin ETF is going to create a path for more other crypto asset ETFs. Most likely we're going to see that with ETH. And who knows, maybe thereafter, XRP or Solana. But again, underneath that, you're now getting traditional FIs very comfortable with the asset class and then the underlying technology where they're starting to build their own solutions. Where we head next, and maybe where we are versus where potentially we head next, is a lot of these banks are building these applications on private and permission networks, right? So that's great from a cost saving standpoint for them. But for the rest of the market, and I think from a more crypto native standpoint, you can't access the benefits of what I had mentioned on the liquidity side. And so I think that's what we're going to start to see a little bit more of. You're already starting to see it, where BlackRock is tokenizing, $100 million fund on Ethereum. And same with actually HSBC with their tokenized gold offerings, along with the Euro Money Market Fund that they had announced maybe 2 weeks ago. So I think you're going to start to see a bit of a battle between these FIs doing this on purely private permission networks, as well as those maybe more so on the asset management side, tokenizing different types of funds on public permissionless networks. I think it's key to do this on public permissionless networks, but we still need to solve for things with regard to data privacy, maybe through zero knowledge proofs in order to actually hit this stuff at scale.
That's great. One thing that, I think you just alluded to it, we're starting to see mainstream institutions like the Bank of America and JPM and HBC and others dabble with the idea of tokenization, and as you said, with these permissioned sort of blockchain environments for tokenization. What will it take for this to scale up? Because scalability is always an issue.
Yeah, I think I've heard for the longest time, this is not a technology problem, it's a regulatory one. And I think we've gotten so far to the point where this regulatory problem is actually creating a technology problem. And what I mean by that is, because there's not clear regulatory clarity globally of how to tokenize assets and trade them, particularly on secondary markets, you're seeing a lot of people at the layer 1 and layer 2 side of things, or even protocols building on top of those, create their own standards, right, for how to tokenize assets in a compliant way. And that's great, but I think we're still creating these different silos of networks, particularly of liquidity. And so I think that, to me, is the biggest way we move forward, is trying to create good, compliant environments for how to tokenize, distribute, and trade these assets on secondary markets. I don't know how we get there. It's going to be a long game. But for us at Ripple, I think at the end of the day, it's going to come down to some degree from a policy standpoint. What is your relationship with these regulators globally? And that is, I think, something we do phenomenally well, where we have a global policy team who are engaging these regulators on a day-to-day, weekly basis, getting them educated on the XRP Ledger, how we at Ripple are building these different payments, custody, and liquidity offerings. And I like sort of the seat that we're in terms of cornering at least a percentage of this tokenization market, because we've been building these institutional enterprise-grade products for 10 plus years. So it's not going to get there in the next 1-2 years, but I think if, again, you think about tens of trillions of dollars coming into this market, underneath all of that, FIs and banks are building their own solutions. If you can sort of tap into public permissionless networks in a way that makes sense for their business, you're going to see an explosion of growth that I frankly don't think we've ever seen.
Yeah, interesting what you said about regulators. So there are actually some regulators you can come in and talk to?
Not in the US, which is where I'm from. But look, I moved to Singapore 8 months ago or so. And there's a reason for that. And I think the MAS, HKMA, what you're seeing in Europe with MiCA, they're really trying to create at least good sandbox environments or guardrails of what you can do versus what you can't do, versus the regulatory by enforcement that you're seeing in the US. So I would say yes, regulators are leaning in specific jurisdictions. And I think Neil had highlighted yesterday, a colleague on the digital solutions team, around 60 to 80% of our customers exist outside the US. And so, yes, you can engage regulators if you're doing it in the right way. And again, having a 10-year track record of supporting different types of institutions globally, building these enterprise-grade solutions, really puts us in a strong position to eventually start to play an active role when you think about tokenization broadly.
Yeah, looking ahead, what do you think is required to generate longevity, stickiness, well beyond the last cycle of DeFi and real-world asset tokenization for it to succeed?
I think it's interoperability, and I think it's interoperability through enabling all of these different token standards that have been launched to talk to each other. I think that does come on the regulatory side of things, because if you don't have clear, compliant tokens that are trading on secondary markets, you don't have liquidity, and you don't have the ability to then create these net new products further downstream. So I think it's one, massively a regulatory issue that we need to solve for, and then secondly, interoperability to enable an asset that is tokenized on Avalanche or Polygon or Solana to then be ported over into the XRP Ledger, maybe via a bridge through Axelar in a compliant way, right? Because banks and asset managers, they have their own set of due diligence processes that they need to abide by, right? These are massive institutions. So what we've seen is that in order to actually work with these banks, they need to get very comfortable with the XRP Ledger as a technology stack, along with XRP, the asset. And that takes time. And so you'd imagine Axelar and these different types of bridging solutions can play a very quick and active role in enabling a tokenized money market fund on Avalanche to be ported into the XRP Ledger. But from a compliance standpoint, that's just not there. And I think we need to solve that, but it will only come through further engagements on the regulatory side.
Do you think the regulation will ever catch up to the technology?
That's a tough one.
I had to ask one hard question.
Yeah, fair enough. Probably not. I mean, I have no idea, but I think what we're seeing is that the regulators are actually more educated than ever because they've been engaged with either folks like Ripple or Circle or others who are building in this space. And so maybe 2-3 years ago, we had to walk into these meetings and basically just educate. They're now very up to speed on what this could mean for them. And that's why I think you're starting to see folks like the MAS and the HKMA create these different types of programs, right, through Project Guardian particularly within Singapore, where they get it. And so will it ever catch up? I don't know, but I don't think it really necessarily needs to, and technology's job is to continue to be on that cutting edge and sort of show us the future of what this could ultimately look like, where you have all these assets in a digital form, and that creates so much more liquidity than was that was possible in the past. And the net new types of product offerings from a financial perspective, I mean, I think they get that, and they want to be first, like the US was on the internet side of things, versus late to the party, because I don't think you can afford to be late to this one.
Sure. And what are you most excited about for the future of DeFi and crypto?
I think the private credit side of things is exciting, right? Like, you've seen a lot of banks move away from supporting these new age fintechs, particularly in emerging markets. And so I don't know when this would happen, but the idea of a fintech in an emerging market holding, their assets in tokenized money market funds that are yield generating assets, and then being able to leverage those assets as collateral to get loans to basically help run their business, or tokenizing the receivables that they produce through their business and leveraging that to secure loans. I'm really excited about that. I think we're not there yet, but particularly us at Ripple, those are the types of use cases that we're really keen on, because those fintechs have custody needs, they have payments needs, and they have liquidity needs. And I think from us, if we can become that one-stop shop for, sure, the more, the larger FIs, but also the cutting-edge fintechs, that's where we want to be. So that is a particular use case that I'm really excited about on the private credit side of things.
There's still people that say today even that crypto has no real world uses. What do you say to that? Even some regulators.
I haven't heard that. Yeah, I fundamentally just don't agree with it, right? I think particularly in the US, people, I can hear that a lot, but travel and go to different jurisdictions and try and leverage. I mean, now I guess we're getting a little bit better on spending credit cards everywhere we go. But look, I think the reality is it's hard to travel and spend money in an efficient way without getting dragged over the coals from an FX standpoint or what have you. So, and also there are folks who don't have the luxuries of, getting bank accounts. And so I fundamentally don't agree with that. And I would really encourage someone who has that point of view to travel and really see if, you can spend your money as freely as you think, and also engage those in different cultures who don't have the luxuries of getting easy bank accounts and transacting globally. So that's probably what my response would be.
Do you think there's any limit to what assets can be tokenized?
I don't think there's a limit. I don't, and Ross actually had mentioned this, it's not hard to tokenize an asset. Creating liquidity for those assets once they're tokenized is the harder part. And so that's, I think, what we've seen on the Ripple X side is it's actually not that difficult to work with an asset manager or a bank to start to tokenize assets and issue them in token form. But creating really good distribution and beefing up that demand side of interested buyers who want to hold these assets without a use case is very difficult. And I think that is what we need to continue to focus on, is not just putting assets on the XRP Ledger, but then creating use cases where you can leverage it, right? And I think you're seeing that happen with JP Morgan's Onyx platform within their tokenized collateral network, right? Where you're tokenizing a BlackRock money market fund, for instance, and then Barclays is using that as collateral to trade in repo. And so that's a use case. And you're seeing the Onyx platform produce $1 billion a day over that platform. And they've issued $700 billion in short-term loans. Again, that's happening on a private permission network, and you're basically only limiting the access of that to JP Morgan's customers. But I think if we can replicate that type of offering on public permissionless networks like the XRP Ledger, that's a use case. And I think we're really missing the use case component. It's not hard to tokenize and issue an asset, but creating liquidity for that and then also creating the use case where it can be leveraged, that's the more difficult part.
What about lending? Obviously, that's a use that people have for any asset, whether it's tokenized or not, to use as collateral for lending.
Yeah, as I mentioned, you're seeing that happen within JP Morgan's platform. You're seeing that happen on more on-chain private credit marketplaces like Maple Finance, Atlantis, and others. Who maybe Goldfinch is another example where they're starting to build these solutions, particularly focused on emerging markets. But I think lending is going to be a massive wave of where tokenized assets can be leveraged as collateral. Again, for these emerging markets, fintechs particularly. And we, Ripple, want to play an active role in helping build those solutions. Maybe we don't do it internally, but we can get these private credit on-chain marketplaces up to speed on the XRP Ledger, have them integrate and support XRPL, and again, eventually, leveraging our Ripple net side of our business, which has global distribution to fintechs, payment service providers, globally, who can access it. So, I think that's the role we want to play, is engaging the more crypto native players, having them get fully up to speed on the benefits of XRPL. But I think a key differentiator of Ripple versus others who are building on these L1s and L2s is we have access to distribution. And so I think that's a big deal, and we're leaning into that quite heavily.
Yeah, a lot of those areas that you've mentioned do really interact with a lot of possible regulatory issues, don't they?
Absolutely. And maybe a question that I have, I haven't spent a ton of time in Australia, but you coming at this from a lawyer and legal background, and there seems to be a lot of good energy and building happening here in Australia. But when you think about tokenizing real world assets in this type of market, from a regulatory standpoint, curious what you see some clear hurdles being, and really what the timelines in order to actually get these assets issued and in production trading on secondary markets globally.
I think, as I said in my speech yesterday, a really big issue for the Australian government, which you can see in the consultation papers, is custody. So with any crypto assets, and as real world assets get increasingly tokenized, you need a custody solution. And I can say from my own experience that people have phoned me as a lawyer and said to me, we want a solution where we don't have to privately custody our assets. We want someone to professionally custody the assets, and we want to be able to borrow against those assets that have been held in custody. But then they say banks won't lend to us against crypto assets, and that may be different when real world assets like property are tokenized, but there doesn't seem to be a solution for those people at the moment.
Well, thank you. And I think for us, picking up on what you mentioned on the custody side, I think that's why we're being rather strategic about certain acquisitions that we're making, right, in the market, because custody is always the first entry point for any institution to access these types of assets. And so not only what we've done with Medico, but standard custody in the US, we're sort of seeing the same theme and narrative around that. So I think at the end of the day, what we're ultimately trying to be is that one-stop shop for any type of institution to take them on a journey into Web3 and crypto broadly. So whether the entry point is on the custody side or the tokenization side or payments, we want to continue to offer sort of horizontal services that they can leverage at their own pace, whether that's on a private permission sidechain of XRP Ledger, XRPL mainnet, or our EVM sidechain. So yeah, I'm very excited about the future here. It's going to take time, right? This stuff isn't going to happen overnight, but I do think we're slightly underestimating what we can do here in the next 10 years versus the next 2 to 3.
Yeah. I think the second part to your question that you asked me is, as I mentioned yesterday, the Australian government is, in the consultation papers, has referred to this phenomenon of financialization of non-financial assets. So when tokenization of real world assets sort of pushes that process along, what will be the regulatory response from governments, including the Australian government? Because will that push these non-financial assets that have been tokenized into the financial services regime, or will they be regulated, at least as assets or the activities connected to those assets outside the financial services regulatory regime? Because it's clear that assets that were not traditionally thought of as financial assets have the potential to be financialized by tokenization.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And even going back to the presentation that you gave yesterday, I think I mentioned this to you at the Hydrate Bar. By the way, what a great name for a bar. If you were to ask me, give me a quiz on sort of what was deemed in this instance a security based on the earn products or the access products, I don't know if I would have got that right. So again, it's not the most interesting or sexy answer here, but I do think this is really going to be, in order to access this type of liquidity in the market, it's going to be a regulatory hurdle and driven by a lot of policy efforts. And you would love to imagine that at the end of the day, the best technology wins, but there is a massive policy effort and undertaking that's going to be required in order for us to actually execute on, I think the quote is bringing tens of trillions of dollars worth of tokenized assets by 2030, for instance.
I think for the record, I think the Australian government is right to focus on intermediary risk. And I think that their comment in the consultation paper, one of the two consultation papers, that custody is the regulatory anchor point, I think they're on the right path. I'm not asking for your opinion, but that's how I see it. I think they're on the right path rather than focusing on the token.
I mean, I would agree. I'm not overly exposed to the Australian market, but again, moving over into Singapore over the last 8 months or so, I've gotten much more up to speed on really what's happening, both from a regulatory standpoint in these APAC markets, as well as, of course, from a technology standpoint. But again, I think from us at Ripple, and that's why it's so great to be here, we can sometimes get lost in just solely what we're building and how we're thinking about the world. And I think is what's so refreshing for me to see is how switched on this crowd is and the different types of applications that they're building. Because at the end of the day, I fully agree with Erie, where Ripple needs to remain to be one contributor to this overall community. And I think, again, what you're seeing within the Root network and different folks building is so crucial for the overall success of the XRP Ledger and the extension of the communities that are really sprouting up. So it's been such a good event, and I think the main thing I want to relay is if you are building anything within sort of the real-world asset tokenization space, we want to talk to you. And not to say we don't want to if you're not, because we want to be users of these different products and offerings. You know, I've, of course, come up against the Solanas and the Polygons and really you name it as far as the L1s and L2s go. But if there's anything I've learned from being here over the last few days, it's the community is building really interesting other applications that aren't necessarily tied to payments or even tokenization of real world assets, but we want to engage with them more on the Ripple side. So first of many, hopefully for us, in terms of coming to these types of events, engaging the community, because I think it's extremely critical.
Any last thoughts or comments on anything?
No, again, just thank you. I think we need to be active in these types of conversations, and would love to meet any number of you who are either building applications and want to engage within how we might be able to work together within the XRPL community as well as Ripple.
It's been an absolute pleasure to meet you and to have the opportunity to come here and ask you some questions. And I know some of them are off the cuff, so thank you very much,
All
Matt.
good. That's why we're here. Thank you.